Trump hit with a big loss today, surrendering to pressure to oust his labor secretary over lenient treatment of sex offender Jeff Epstein. Secretary Acosta stridently defending himself Wednesday. By Friday morning today, he's toast, which contradicts Trump's public embrace. His team had also said this week there was, quote, zero chance he fires Acosta right away. Fact check false. It turns out that zero chance was more like 100% chance. This loss comes a day after Trump admitted defeat on the court battle over the census. Another surrender that follows months of bluster where he claimed he wouldn't surrender. And a reminder of one key principle for the Trump era from our colleague, Rachel Maddow.
Don't listen to what they say they're going to do. Look at what they are actually doing. Don't watch what they say. Watch what they do. We have taken it as a general mantra to watch what they do, not what they say. Don't listen to what they say. Watch what they do.
Watch what they do. And this came in part in response to intrepid reporting by Miami Herald journalists who exposed the depth of the scandal, plus prominent Democrats who pressed and demand Acosta's ousting. I'm joined now by Neera Tanden, President and CEO of the Center for American Progress, who also worked for Obama and Clinton. Good to see you.
Great to see you.
How do you view this as a story about ignoring most of what the White House says and looking at the facts as they piled up?
Yeah, I mean, I think 3 years into this or 2.5 years into this, I think most of us recognize that whatever the White House backgrounds to reporters has a, 10%, 20%, 30% chance of being true a day, 2 days, 3 days, or sometimes a few months later. So I think the question is really, why is there any credibility given to White House statements, White House background, White House, senior aide says, when it's so often proven to be false, as Acosta saw himself this morning?
Do you view, as a student of Washington who's been in these high-profile positions that most people have not, do you view this as something that would have happened without that Miami Herald reporting that I mentioned?
Oh, absolutely not. Of course, Donald Trump himself, if anything, has shown a blind eye to this kind of scandal, particularly scandals that affect the treatment and impact the treatment of women. And so I think it was really just the added detail after detail after detail, and the incredible reporting just about how much Acosta acted to protect Epstein. It's not that he just didn't prosecute, but the way he handled this, it really created security for Epstein against future prosecution, which took years, as we've seen now, years for a better and more able prosecutor to pierce.
So how do you view this as, I don't know if Cap identifies as in the resistance or not, but you're a very powerful...
More in the resistance than not.
Right, and you're a powerful force in Washington. But I'm sure, Neera, you hear from people, I know I do, anecdotally, oh, quote, nothing matters. Oh, okay, they reported a thing that is outrageous, scandalous, terrible. But what's it going to lead to? And it actually seems, I mean, the Miami Herald, and I say this out of respect for them, it's not like they had the largest, most well-funded megaphone in the world, but they did dogged reporting, print reporting, and that drove something. How does all of this, in your view, relate to the larger political project, which is a world where people are somewhat exhausted and cynical at times?
I, in fact, think this is an incredibly important point, which is you see a lot of this. A lot of people are just, sort of bogged down by the terrible news, the scandal. Many people sort of thought of the reporting on Epstein, which is particularly horrifying in its predatory nature, as almost part of the haze of scandal. And what I think is really important with this and with the census is Trump can be forced to be backed down by public scandal and actually by the courts, that resisting, opposing, energizing people can actually have real results, particularly as we have news of these horrifying detention camps. I do think people are so incredibly wary. But Acosta learned that it actually matters that you have a level of scandal that, even Trump can be forced to act.
Right. And as you say, all indication with their 0% quote and all that was they don't want to do anything. Trump wanted to back him up, give a press conference, almost it doesn't matter what you say. just put it out there. No, you're fact-checked by the reporters I mentioned. You're fact-checked by local prosecutors. You're fact-checked by other experts, and it overwhelmed him. And that would seem to be important, and I say that as an observation about the substance, not, of course, the wider politics of it, which is why we thought you'd be interesting to hear from on this. Neera Tanden.
I'll just say one
Sure.
additional point. I do want to note the heroism of the women
Yes.
who are coming forward. I think that also contributed to the fact that you heard a woman in her voice talk about what happened to her. You know, she's a hero. These women are heroes. Those voices made this change happen as well.
Yeah, 100%. And when I'm referencing the Miami piece, it had quoted on background anonymously. Many of those people, as you say, some came forward, including to our own Savannah Guthrie. So I appreciate your addition there as well. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.